Hello, welcome. Nearing the end of a long and busy day. My name is Eric Schoenberg, and I do teach a class on family business at the Wharton School. But in the interest of full disclosure, I will acknowledge that that's not actually the reason I was invited to speak here today. The reason is pure nepotism. Our host, A.J. Jacobs, is married to my sister, Julie. I will further mention that when AJ first raised the idea for this global family reunion and explained to me that part of his reasoning was this theory that if we all just recognize the truth that we are in fact related, the world would be a better place, my immediate reaction was to say, AJ, I guess you haven't seen too many family businesses in action, have you? Because I feel pretty sure that everybody in this audience can tell me about a story of a family that they knew that were in business together, where there was conflict and the end result was the destruction of the business, the family, or both. Now, partly this is because family businesses, in fact, are a very important part of our economy. It's estimated that roughly 80 to 90% of all businesses in the United States are family businesses. And of course, the vast majority of those are kind of mom and pop stores and bodegas and the like. But it is also true that roughly 1/3 of the Fortune 500 list of the largest companies in the United States are considered to be controlled by families. That, of course, leaves the fact that 2/3 of the large business in the United States are not controlled by families. So let me twist AJ's idea a little bit and ask a slightly different question, which is, would businesses be better off if they all considered themselves to be part of one big family? So this is really a question of, do family businesses generate greater returns for their shareholders than non-family businesses? And one of my colleagues at Wharton, Rafi Amit, with a collaborator at NYU named Belen Villalonga, have looked at exactly this question. And what they found was a little bit complicated. What they found was only those family businesses where the founder was still in charge, or where the family continued to own it but had brought in an outsider as the CEO, those businesses had greater returns for their shareholders. Okay? But if we were in the second generation or beyond, and the family was still controlling the business, and one of the members of the family was the CEO of this business, then it was not more profitable for their shareholders in general, but it was more profitable for the family. So we really have to think about two questions that we have to keep in mind. When we say, would the world be a better place, we have to ask, how are we going to define that? And then secondly, better for whom? Now, of course, I do teach at a business school, and at a business school, we traditionally think the right metric for whether things are better is profitability. I'm actually a psychologist by training, and so I don't necessarily accept this idea. And in fact, what I'm really more interested in is the question of not, is the profit pool bigger? Is the pie bigger as a whole? But what are the consequences of family relationships for how the pie gets divided? How we decide who gets what? And I want to start with a little story that is actually a legal case that was decided by the Supreme Court of Vermont in 1924. The story begins in 1899. In 1899, Joseph Waterman, a 48-year-old widower with 4 children, hired Mina Stewart, who was age 24, to be his housekeeper. Now, within a matter of months, Joseph and Mina had started an intimate relationship, and they agreed to pose publicly as man and wife. This situation sustained itself for 10 years, but in 1909, Mina left because she was unhappy that Joseph had long since stopped paying her wages. She agreed to return in exchange for Joseph giving her $100 and committing to deed her his house after he passed. Another dozen years passed, and Mina finally decided to leave for good, and she sued to recover her unpaid wages. So the question was, is Mina entitled to this money? And here's what the court said. The court said, if she was his housekeeper, she is, of course, entitled to unpaid wages, but if in fact she was his mistress, then she was not. Implying that from a legal perspective, the nature of the social relationship with these people determined what was appropriate and fair. Now, you might say, the problem here is they weren't actually married. And if Mina and Joseph had actually been married, then she would have been entitled to a divorce settlement. And that's true, but I'd like to make 3 points about that. Point number 1 is she would still not be entitled to wages. And in fact, the recent reaction to this book, Primates of Park Avenue, which talked about the idea of a wife bonus. How many people in this audience have heard about this? So this is the idea that on wealthy families where there's a very hedge fund manager in New York City who makes a lot of money, when the wife does not work and stays at home, the wife receives a bonus at the end of the year based on her performance at her wifely duties. Now, if you haven't had that story, you're hearing it now, and the point being that a lot of people have a very negative reaction to this idea. It is not simply the case that if they had been married that it would have been considered appropriate for her to receive wages. The second point is it is true in roughly 9 states in the United States, there is what's called community property law, in which case she would be entitled to half of all of Joseph's assets regardless. It wouldn't be a question of wages, it would be just half of whatever he has. And we'll come back to this idea, but in most states, a divorce settlement is based on what's called an equitable arrangement, which is to say, what is a fair way to divide these assets based on what people have contributed to the marriage? So, of course, when we get to the question of what is fair, there is no objective standard. So as a psychologist who likes to do experiments with people, I'm going to actually ask this group of people to participate with me today in a very simple little experiment. I'm going to give you 3 little scenarios, and I want everybody in the audience to vote on which of the distributions I'm going to show you is fairer. So let's start with the first example. So imagine 2 people, Pat and Chris. They are unrelated. And in honor of the fact that much of AJ's family tree consists of lawyers, I've decided to say they go into the law practice together. All right, now, of course, when you're in law, basically your revenue, your profitability is going to depend almost entirely on your billable hours. And let's say that before these 2 partners join, they realize that due to a more extensive list of contacts and perhaps just a willingness to work harder, Pat is going to work twice as hard as Chris and generate twice as many billable hours as Chris. So they have to agree how they're going to split the profits at the end of the year, and I want you to act like a judge or a jury or a mediator and say, which of these 2 distributions do you think is better? And I will leave it to you to define for yourself what better means. But you only have 2 choices. I'm going to force you to choose one of these 2. I'd like everybody in the audience to tell me, how many of you think a better distribution would be 50-50? Please put your hands up. Okay. How many of you think a better distribution would be 2/3, 1/3 to represent? Okay. So there is a lot of research that's been done on people's perceptions of fairness, and this is what is called equity. All right. The idea being that a fair distribution is one where what you receive depends on what you contribute. And I think most of us can recognize why that's an important sense of fairness. Let's slightly change this scenario. Pat and Chris are married. But all of the other facts are exactly the same. So now I ask the audience, how many of you think in this scenario a better way to distribute the profits is 50-50? And how many of you think it should remain 2/3, 1/3? So now let me go back a moment to the idea of a community property state and simply note, by matter of law, this is required in a community property state. That is what community property means. If a married couple earns money together, the money is equally split. Now let me go to one more slightly different scenario. So imagine Pat and Chris are married and they have 2 children, Kim and Alex. Now these children are already adults. Alex works as an investment banker and, needless to say, makes considerably more money than Kim who works as a public high school teacher. Okay? Now, once again, you are a mediator. You are deciding what's going to be done. But now it is not the profits of the business. Well, what's going to happen is Pat and Chris decide they don't need the profits. They've got plenty of money. They want to give some of these profits to their 2 children. What is a better distribution? Should they distribute equally to their 2 children? How many people think that's a better distribution? Should they give twice as much to Kim? How many people think that's a better distribution? So notice that in this case, the bulk of you felt that an equitable distribution was correct, was better. Now here's an interesting fact about this. Of course, we do have a lot of data about what people actually do in this situation when they pass away. And in fact, we have data about what they do when they give money even before they pass away. So when people pass away, roughly 2/3 of the time, they give money equally to their children when they have more than 1 children. All right? Now, given what we just went through, this shouldn't be surprising to many people in the audience, because most of you said that was a better way to distribute the money, equally. But if you take a step back and ask yourself the question, why do people leave money to their children? Because, in standard economic theory, or perhaps you don't know this, in standard economic theory, people are assumed to be entirely self-centered and focused solely on themselves. Now, economists, though they are peculiar in some ways, are not complete idiots, and they recognize the fact that many people do, in fact, leave money for their children. So they've tried to come up with what they call the bequest motivation. What is the motivation that lies behind this bequest? And the puzzling thing is, there is no rational motivation that economists have been able to come up with that explains why people leave money 50-50. And the reason why is simply this, that if your purpose is to improve the lives of your children, and you further believe that money is more valuable to people who have less of it, it has what's called the declining marginal utility. And, that seems pretty obvious. Giving $100 to somebody who is a public high school teacher should have a greater impact on their well-being than giving $100 to somebody who is an investment banker. If you accept all those premises, then you should, in fact, not leave money equally to your children. Rather, you should distribute it based on who's going to get more benefit from it. Now, here's the last little interesting factoid, which is, in point of fact, when people give money to their children when they are still alive, 75% of the time they give money unequally. So, this is a very large and broad topic, and I do teach an entire semester about this stuff. But the message I'm trying to communicate here, linking it back to this idea of, would the world be a better place if we always recognize that we're family members, is it depends on what we're trying to accomplish. And the biggest problems arise, the reasons I see so many family businesses fall apart, is when there is a disconnect, when people have different perspectives about what standard of fairness should be applied. The reason people like equity, when we're talking about unrelated people in a business, is we believe it provides the right incentives for people to work harder and generate the profit. But when we're talking about family, we think there's a whole different set of standards that apply. And to bring this point home, I want to tell you a little story. It's a book that was written a few years called The Bill from My Father. And it's written by this gentleman whose father was a famously litigious attorney. And when this gentleman turned 28 years old, his father sent him a bill for $2 million for having raised him. If you think of the world as being like a business, there is nothing objectionable or strange about that story. But if you think about the nature of familial relationships, you will immediately realize there's a serious problem that's going to arise here. And what I try and do in my own work is make people clear, You can care more about the business, you can care more about the family, but when you don't acknowledge these facts, you're going to run into trouble. Thank you very much.